Old School Lane Casual Chats is brought to you by oldsschoollane.blogspot.com and is associated with Manic Expression, the Comic Book Cast, the Reopen Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, Florida Facebook page, the PlayStation Let's Play channel, and for entertainment's sake.
We're tiny, we're toony, we're all a little loony, and in this cartoony we're invading your TV. We're comic dispensers, we crack up all the censors. On Tiny Toon Adventures, get a dose of comedy. So here's at the acres, it's a whole wide world apart. Our home sweet home stands alone, a cartoon work of art.
The scripts were rejected, expect the unexpected.
On Tiny Toon Adventures, it's about to start.
They're furry, they're funny.
They're Baz and Buster Bunny, Montana Max has money, Elmira is a pain. He's hunting
And plucky.
Dizzy Devil yucky, her balls are kooky, and Go-Go is insane. At Acme University we earn our Toon degree. The teaching staff's been getting laughs since 1933. We're tiny, we're toony, we're all a little loony. It's Tiny Toon Adventures, come and join the fun. And now our song is done.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Casual Chats. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Patricia.
And, wow, how long has it been, Patty, since you and I have done a podcast solo, or just a podcast in general?
It's been a while, that's for sure, but I'm glad that we can be able to have some time to spend together, and for everybody who has been on board with Casual Chats, with Kevin being really busy, I want to thank you all so much. You guys have been really awesome, but now things are slowly getting back on track with the two of us coming together and talking about our favorite shows and movies and stuff in between. The remaining Casual Chats will be about the Spielberg-produced cartoons around the 90s. So we're going to start it off with Tiny Toon Adventures, and then we'll conclude it with Pinky, Elmira, and the Brain. So we're going to start off with Tiny Toon Adventures, which debuted on September of 1990. That means that this month it'll be celebrating its 25th anniversary. So what better time than to do it now? So right before we discuss about the show, Kevin, how did you first get introduced to it?
I first got into Tiny Toons, it was on Fox Kids on Channel 5. It was on in the afternoons, and being a long-time Looney Tune fans, I remember that, with Tiny Toons, a lot of people, they don't necessarily say it, but they say that it's kind of similar to Jim Henson's Muppet Babies, which actually started the trend of having younger versions of cartoon characters or, celebrities. Not to derail from Tiny Toon Adventures, but, Jim Henson's Muppet Babies was, as the title says, was baby versions of the Muppets, like Kermit and Miss Piggy and Fozzie and Gonzo. And, the show was successful. In fact, it's one of the most successful Saturday morning cartoons ever produced. And it lasted from 1984 to 1992, just to show you how successful it is. And it took home a lot of Emmys. Because of that, a lot of networks wanted to capitalize on that. They wanted to see what else they can do. Oddly enough, Roseanne Barr had a show, and that was called Little Rosie. And as you can imagine, again, because at the time Roseanne was such a very popular sitcom, ABC decided that they wanted to do a television show that showed a younger version of Roseanne. And, it pretty much had the adult characters on the show Roseanne as little kids. And again, also at the same time, there was Tom and Jerry Kids, which again took the iconic cartoon characters Tom and Jerry and had them as little kids. So, you had all these shows. So, again, the idea of doing a Tiny Toon show where the Looney Tune characters were kids was really interesting. And I remember, and Patty will correct me on this as usual, but I remember that before there was Tiny Toons, there was a story that went around that after Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Steven Spielberg and Amblin Entertainment wanted to do a Roger Rabbit cartoon show. But unfortunately, I think that fell through, or they, for obvious reasons, I guess they, I don't know if they, what had happened with that. But eventually we would get Bonkers, which is another show altogether. So he did a version of, like a child version of Looney Tunes, which is Tiny Toon Adventures. And to say how I got into the show, basically I just fell in love with it when I watched the first episode. I thought it was really cool that we had the adult Looney Tune characters. It was hilarious because it was very, 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 like, it poked fun of a lot of what was going on today in Hollywood. There was a lot of satires on movies and television shows, and it was hilarious. And it still holds up today because I watched a couple of the reruns, I watched the show again recently, and it's just hilarious. It really is. And the merchandise was amazing. There were plush dolls that everyone remembered. There were talking dolls of Buster and Babs. There were the McDonald Happy Meal toys that everyone remembers, like the little race cars that they used to have. Video games. I mean, Tiny Toon Adventures was so... I really personally think it was the Muppet Babies of the 90s because it was just all over the place. And it had every right to because it was just so good. The writing was so brilliant. The voice casting on the show was amazing. You had such amazing stars like Charlie Adler, Rob Paulson. Another thing about the show that I liked was that it had a Roger Rabbit feeling. Roger Rabbit, as a lot of people know, is one of my favorite movies. And in the show, Roger makes 2 cameo appearances, although you kind of know it's Roger, but it doesn't look like Roger, obviously for the color tone of the fur and, the outfit, which it looks like Roger Rabbit. But anyway, there were a lot of references to Roger Rabbit. In the movie, there was a thing called the Dip, which would disintegrate cartoon characters. In the television show, there was this black ink that would kind of dissolve the characters as well. Toons, the name Toons, the term Toons was used frequently on Tiny Toon Adventures. And it had that feeling to it. And that's what I really liked about it. For a show like that, I watched it religiously when it was on Monday through Friday in the afternoon, and then because it became so popular, Fox decided to put it on Saturday mornings, which is how Animaniacs was the same way, And I liked that the characters, they gave a lot of characters personalities that were that really stood out, like Elmira, which everybody loves Elmira because she's just this nut job, and she's sort of a caricature to Elmer Fudd. How Elmer Fudd wanted to hunt animals. Elmira, who kind of looks like Elmer Fudd, wanted to squeeze the hell out of animals. Montana Mac, same thing with Yosemite Sam, Plucky Duck, Daffy Duck, Hampton, Porky Pig, And what I liked about the show was that, with Bugs Bunny, there was both a boy and girl bunny because the girls, liked Babs, the boys liked Buster, but still, both Buster and Babs had that Bugs Bunny attribute to them. So it was like you got a male Bugs Bunny and a female Bugs Bunny, and I think that was wonderful. I really think that was great diversity on the writer's part. And, it was really one of those shows that was just so 90s because it did, because it was released by Warner Brothers, they were able to, poke fun of Tim Burton, Steven Spielberg even, which I thought was hilarious, Batman, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and even shows like movies too, like Edward Scissorhands. I remember there was like a joke reference of Edward Scissorhands. One of them, which I thought, which was really, really hilarious, was Freddy Krueger. There was one with Plucky Duck, I believe. He was dressed as Freddy Krueger in one episode. Then there was the one where they were like this tiger, and they poked fun of A Nightmare on Elm Street, which I thought was brilliant because, Tiny Toons is like many cartoons of the 90s. It was a show that both adults and children could enjoy. And being that Nightmare on Elm Street obviously was not appropriate for children, they were able to see that, Freddy Krueger was everywhere. They were able to poke fun of Freddy Krueger for kids. Same thing with Beavis and Butthead and Ren and Stimpy. That was not, Beavis and Butthead obviously was not appropriate for the demographic of Tiny Toons. but the creators and the writers were able to poke fun of Beavis and Butthead because that was popular in the 90s. You know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles again. So I love that they were able to satire so much stuff, and that's what made the show so memorable. Julie Brown was even on the show, and they poked fun of Julie Brown. And Julie Brown, God bless her, I love her. She's, she is like the queen of satire. The Julie Brown show. Her music videos, and she enjoyed it so much. So she was on the show, as well. So that's what got me into Tiny Toons was just the first episode where we're introduced to the characters, and this writer's trying to come up with a new show, and Buster and Babs and Bugs Bunny. There's this framed photo of Bugs Bunny, and he watches Buster and Babs, and they create Acme Acres. I thought it was brilliant, and ever since then, and then even the band episodes where they get drunk. And the steroid episode, those were heavy topics, but Tiny Toons was able to make it so that kids can learn from this, which I thought was just amazing in itself. And I think that's what makes the show stand out some more. And I really think it should get more praise than it does. I think it should be up there with, the Flintstones and the Jetsons, because it's such a huge part of the 90s, Tiny Toons. Not just the fact that it was just everywhere. I mean, there was kids with lunch boxes and book bags and everything like that, and VHSs. I mean, I think everyone owned the Vacation episode, My Greatest Vacation.
Oh my God, yes. I have a story to talk about Tiny Toon Adventures, how I spent my vacation.
Yeah, I'm going to give the floor to Patty because I think I pretty much said enough, but I can't think of anyone who did not own that VHS, or at least did not watch that episode, because that was just so popular. And again, there was a Jason Voorhees reference. I mean, a Texas Chainsaw Massacre reference in that show with the serial killer, the guy with the chainsaw. So
there was Jason Voorhees reference in that, and it was great. And there's so much stuff to talk about, but trust me, we'll get to that when we get to that. Anyway.
So, I'm going to give the floor to Patty. Patty, explain to us how did you get into Tiny Toons?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it. When I was a kid and I was watching Looney Tunes reruns, I saw in the commercials about this new program called Tiny Toon Adventures, and I was like, oh wow, it's like a kid version of of Looney Tunes. That looks pretty cool. And coming into it's like you were saying before, Kevin, coming in from the popularity of shows such as Muppet Babies and A Pup Named Scooby-Doo and Tom and Jerry Kids. All of these cartoons that were really popular around the 40s and 50s and 60s, they were all generating these younger kid versions for kids who grew up in the 80s and 90s. And when I saw Tiny Toons, I was really enthralled by it. It felt like the Looney Tunes, but for our generation. It had a lot of great characters, and it had a lot of great episodes. A lot of my favorite characters, of course, were the usual, Buster and Babs and Plucky and Hampton. And then, of course, you have Elmira, whom, she's a really hilarious character with just chasing around animals and hugging them, especially with Furball. And you have Dizzy, who's the younger version of the Tasmanian Devil. Fifi LaFume, who was a female version of Pepe Le Pew. And then, of course, there was Sweetie Bird, who was a female version of Tweety, and so on and so forth. And one of the great things that I like about Tiny Toons was that they were even able to bring back really obscure characters, for example, the Dodo, who was actually the only time in which you saw the Dodo was in a Bob Clampett cartoon called Porky Pig in Wacky Land. And I think he appeared maybe once or twice, but for the most part he was a pretty much obscure character, and they were able to showcase him in the episode in which Babs didn't want to follow her mom's rules, and she was starting to become out of control, so she moves over to the Dodo Land, and she got to do whatever she wanted, and then eventually the Dodos drove her so crazy that she started yelling at them saying, why can't you guys have self-control? And then she kind of has a flashback. It's oh man, everybody else has been telling me to, self-control myself. And then she learns a lesson about how you can be funny and silly at times, but you have to know when to cool it down, and you need to know when enough is enough. And then, of course, one of the great things about Tiny Toons was that they were able to include other, like female characters, because in Looney Tunes, the only female characters you had were, for the most part, more like the side characters. There weren't a lot of major characters of Looney Tunes. I mean, you had Granny, you had Witch Hazel, and, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, you had Granny and you had Witch Hazel, and then you had, like, some one-off female characters, but for the most part, there were no major female characters in the Looney Tunes. We wouldn't even have, like, Lola Bunny until, like, years later, like, around the late 90s when Space Jam came out. So seeing, Babs Bunny and Shirley the Loon and Fifi, and Sweetie, bringing in some females into the show, and that was really great, especially with Babs. Babs was, like, my favorite, because she was, like, really crazy and kooky, and she was always playing around with Buster, trying to get across his antics, and they just worked so well together. And that's one of the good things, too, because the female characters were just as interesting as the male characters. I mean, no offense to, like, shows around the 80s and early 90s, but every time that they had a female version of a character, it just basically was just a copy of a male version. Like, you had Smurfette, and she was, like, the only female, and you had characters like Judy Jetson, who was, for the most part, the only female who wasn't like Rosie, who was a cleaning bot. And the voice actors who performed as these roles did amazing. They were able to bring energy to the show that was desperately needed. Like Babs, performed by Tress MacNeille, was hysterical. She was amazing.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to ask you a quick question, because, not to interrupt, but you actually brought something that was really interesting. Tiny Toons was released in 1990, which was the same year, and I know Patty's going to like this because, she is the Nickelodeon queen. Doug and Rugrats they were released in 1991.
Yeah,
correct?
Yeah, they were.
So they were released a year before. Would you say that Tiny Toons, before you go on, would you go as far as say that Tiny Toons started a trend of diversity of both male and female characters, whereas that the female characters were your stereotypical female characters, that these were characters that, that the audiences can like, and that they just didn't have the Mary Sue qualities that we would see in the 80s? I mean, even though some would argue that, when you had characters like Tila or April O'Neil or Janine Melvitz, or Baby Piggy in the 80s cartoon, would you go as far as say that Tiny Toons really started a trend of having, female characters that really acted like females?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Not only just female characters, but the addition of more female characters. Like, there were more female characters that were introduced. Like you were mentioning before about, like April O'Neil and Baby Piggy and, She-Ra or Jem. All of those characters, for the most part, they were like, they were either like the only females in the show, or they were carbon copies of their male counterparts. So with Tiny Toons, I mean, for the most part, Elmira was a female version of Elmer Fudd. They could have easily changed Elmira into a male. Fifi LaFume was a female version of Pepe Le Pew. They could have easily changed him to a male. Sweetie was a female version of Tweety. They could have easily changed him to a male. Babs Bunny and Shirley the Loon were like female versions of Bugs and Daffy, respectively, and they could have easily, been like a best friend sidekick. But the great thing about it is that they were able to become diverse, and they were able to have characters that girls can be able to look up to. One of the great things about Tiny Toons was that not only boys could enjoy it, but girls could enjoy it. Around the 90s, this was a time in which you have a cartoon that both boys and girls can enjoy. Because I don't know what it was about the 80s, but there always seemed to be like a division about, He-Man was a boys' cartoon, Jem was a girls' cartoon, Transformers was a boys' cartoon, My Little Pony was a girls' cartoon. Sure, boys can watch My Little Pony, and, today's boys do. Not saying anything about bronies, no offense, just saying that boys back then in the 80s didn't want to admit that they were, and girls could easily watch He-Man if they didn't want to watch She-Ra, but again, they would most likely lean towards She-Ra because she was a kick-ass girl. But the great thing about something like Tiny Toons is that they had a diversity of male and female characters. And the female characters were just as captivating as the male characters. And we wouldn't have that until, later on when we had shows like Doug, in which we had characters like Patty Mayonnaise and Connie and BB. And then Rugrats, we would have characters like Lil, Susie, Angelica. And then it continued on and on throughout the, even still to this day, where we have characters, that are animated that people love, like Steven Universe. A lot of people love the Crystal Gems. And with Adventure Time, we have Princess Bubblegum and Marceline. And also Gravity Falls. People love Mabel. I mean, I don't know if we can, truly say that Tiny Toons was like the starting point of all these great female characters, but it was one of the first steps towards like great female characters. And yes, just like you were saying before, Kevin, there was a lot of episodes that were kind of controversial, like the steroid episode and the episode in which Buster and Buster and Plucky and Hampton, they raid over the fridge and then they find beer and then they start drinking it and get themselves drunk. Yeah, there were a lot of episodes that were clearly not for kids. And while Animaniacs would be the one that had the double entendre humor, Tiny Toons did have a lot of episodes that dealt with things like self-esteem, and it dealt with a lot of violence, like slapstick violence, and it had a lot of parodies and references towards Hollywood. And that was a great thing to feature because seeing, all of these references, and we kind of laugh at it, and then we look back on it, it's like, oh, I didn't know about that reference the first time. Oh, they were referencing Nightmare on Elm Street, they were referencing Chainsaw Massacre, they were referencing Friday the 13th, Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Oh, look, there's Roseanne, or, vice versa. And that's one of the good thing about Tiny Toons. It's like, before South Park came out a few years afterwards, they used to make fun of celebrities all the time. No celebrity was safe. Every single celebrity was made fun of in some way. Like in Tiny Toons, How I Spend My Vacation, Roseanne was singing the Star Spangled Banner in a horrible way. It was making fun of the fact that when Roseanne actually sung the Star Spangled Banner during the World Series, about how much everybody hated her singing because it was awful. The good thing about Tiny Toons was that a lot of the characters were featured in some episodes. Some episodes you had Buster and Babs. Some episodes you had Plucky and Hampton. Some episodes you had Montana Max and Elmira. Each and every single one of them had like great moments. Like one of the best episodes in the entire series that people still remember to this day is when baby Plucky learned about how to use the potty. And he would, learn about how to use the potty and not wearing any diapers. And then he said the infamous line when he started learning about how to flush the toilet, from his dad, and he, stuffed the toilet paper and stuff and he would stuff the toilet paper in the toilet, and he started stuffing in more things. He would say things like, water go down the hole. I remember so much that when I was a kid, I remember that line so much that every time that I used the restroom and I would finish my business, I would say, water go down the hole. And that, of course, was performed by Tom Ruger's son, Nathan Ruger. Nathan Ruger actually played as baby Plucky, and then later on he would play as the baby squirrel from Animaniacs. Skippy, that's what his name was. Skippy Squirrel from Animaniacs, and then he would play as other characters. And then there was one episode that actually featured They Might Be Giants with the song Particle Man, where Plucky is participating in a huge wrestling match. And he's beaten to death with, all the wrestlers that are participating. And I think that song was made for Tiny Toons. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was made for, that song Particle Man was made for Tiny Toons because the wrestler was named Particle Man, and then it fit really well with the song, so I'm not sure. But yeah, Tiny Toons is a really great show. Came out in the beginning of the 90s. Looking back on it, yes, there are some things that are referenced that maybe kids nowadays won't get because, it was in the 90s. But for the most part, it is smartly written. The episodes are hilarious. The references are just great. And really funny to look back on. And the satire is still sharp. It's still a great cartoon. It holds up really well. It brought Looney Tunes in for a new generation of kids, and yeah, I really, really like this show. And I know that this show is kind of one-off, but with Animaniacs, because Tiny Toons was directed towards for a more younger audience. But you have to understand that, before Tom Ruegger created, all the shows that would lead up to, kind of like the Looney Tunes renaissance of the 90s, produced by Steven Spielberg, before that, he was on A Pup Named Scooby-Doo. He was a writer of a lot of Hanna-Barbera cartoons like Huckleberry Hound. And, he had a knowledge of all the stuff that they did, like, with A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, it had a lot of satire, and it did a lot of references to itself. And for the most part, he was able to take that, and he was able to integrate it for the Looney Tunes. And he would do that pretty much throughout the 90s, and, later on he would do that kind of style with his own creations later on, like with Hysteria, and even today with the 7Ds. So, yeah, it's still an amazing show, and I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, with that out of the way, Kevin, let's talk about who our favorite characters are, and what our favorite episodes are.
I would have to definitely go with Buster Bunny and Plucky Duck. Hands down. And Elmira. I also actually like when Elmira and Montana Max, when she goes crazy over Montana Max.
Yeah, my favorite characters are Buster and Babs. Plucky, I love. Hampton is a great character. He's like Porky, but he's still a really hilarious character. And nonetheless, was performed by the late Don Messick, the voice of Scooby-Doo. I remember this one story from Talking Tunes with Rob Paulson, in which they wanted Don Messick to swear, because he doesn't ordinarily swear, and then when they finally convinced him to do it, he said in his Hampton voice, he said, "Blow me!" And everybody was laughing so hard, because imagine Hampton Pig say, "Blow me." Wow. The one episode that I do remember that I thought was really cool was Plucky was skipping out on his homework, and then when school was starting and he had to turn in his homework, he invented a time machine so he can go back in time and talk about, hey, do your homework, man. And then he accidentally sends him, Babs and Buster over towards the time of the dinosaurs, and then they had to get themselves out. There were two shows that kind of reminded me of that plot. One was a Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy episode, and the other one was a Jimmy Neutron episode. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, it had, Billy not doing his homework, and then he invented a time machine so he can be able to do his homework. And then the Jimmy Neutron episode, in which in which Jimmy had the time machine, and then they accidentally went over to prehistoric times. So I just kind of find that to be interesting. I mean, I take it that's just a coincidence, but I just kind of find it interesting about how having, two of those shows kind of do a similar thing to what happened to a Tiny Toons episode. And then, of course, I can't talk about a particular Tiny Toons episode without bringing up this interesting fact. The episode of Ren and Stimpy called Haunted House, in which Ren and Stimpy go over to the haunted house, and there's this ghost that tries to scare them, but it's ineffective because this ghost is horrible at scaring Ren and Stimpy?
Well, actually, I do. And it's funny that you bring that up. That's actually one of the banned episodes that they only aired maybe once or twice on Nickelodeon. And they did not air that episode in reruns. In fact, long story short, and then I'll let Patty talk, the episode was so banned that when Nicktoons, Nickelodeon's sister network, the 24-hour channel that had Nickelodeon shows, classic Nickelodeon shows, now they just air, what's currently on Nickelodeon in a marathon. They would not air that episode along with several other episodes, but they had their own music videos, and don't ask me why, but they show clips, maybe one or two clips from that episode, but they won't show the full episode. Go figure.
Yeah, I know. Well, believe it or not, that was originally supposed to be a Tiny Toon Adventures episode.
And how did it get to be a Ren and Stimpy episode?
Well, that is a long, long, long story, but I will give you the short end of it. So, From what I understand, the episode was supposed to be about that Hampton and Plucky were supposed to go into this house about the dodos. Apparently, the episode kind of just got sidelined, and it didn't feel like a Tiny Toons episode. And then Bob Camp came along, who was kind of like, seeing the production of Tiny Toons at that time, and he saw the episode, and he thought that maybe they can work something with it. So they changed it into Ren and Stimpy going over to the haunted house instead, and then it was created into its own episode. And yeah, apparently, Haunted House was originally supposed to be a Tiny Toon Adventures episode. Except, of course, it's a lot different. If you want to know more information about that, there is a book called Sick Little Monkeys, the Unauthorized Ren and Stimpy story that will get you more information. Or you can just look it up online. There's an article about it. I'm telling you in more details, but trust me, it's a very interesting story.
Didn't Plucky and Hampton did go to a haunted house with a banshee?
Yeah, that was reworked a little bit later. So I take it that maybe that's where the remnants of it came, went over to. The episode in which Plucky and Hampton go over to the Banshee's house.
Gotcha.
Okay, so let's conclude it with talking about Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation, because I have a long story to talk about that movie.
Wait a minute, I didn't say my favorite episode.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. What are your favorite episodes of Tiny Toons?
I was to say, I gotta vote in this too, don't I?
Oh, yes. I am sorry. This is a democratic. This is not a dictatorship. Go ahead, Kev.
No, it's all right. Everyone knows I always jab by Patty, but I would have to say I have 3 favorite episodes. The first episode, I don't know them by names. Please don't be mad at us. If you decide that you want to curse and say any derogatory messages because I have a lack of the names of these episodes, feel free to email me personally. Do not email Patty. You can send me a Facebook message privately. I'd be happy to read them. Why the heck not? I would have to say one of the episodes is where they had this FCC lady, and Therese McNeil played her, and she was no nonsense, and she had a machine that would suck. I guess because, don't ask me why they didn't call it their souls, because technically it was their souls, but she would suck out their funniness, and it would be in this machine, and then what happened is at the end, Buster broke the machine, because his funny soul got trapped, and then everybody's soul went into different bodies, and it was pretty funny. The other episode is the one where there was this black ink, this dissolving black ink that was gonna drown all the characters, and it took up the whole screen, so it was really funny. And the third episode, and then I'll let Patty tell my vacation story, is the one where it was a haunted house one, and one by one the characters were being... Actually, I have one more, and then I'll let Patty go. And they were all being kidnapped one by one, and there was a villain on the show. They actually did have villains on the show. One of them was a mad scientist, and he one by one had... they all went to this haunted house, and he kidnapped them. And the last one... And this would and still to this day, at 28 years old, still makes me laugh, is the Carrie... the parody where Shirley the Loon becomes like Carrie. They're at a prom, and Fifi and Babs they see this, and it's like, oh no, she's at it again, because and they have the red punch, and she does the whole character thing. It was hilarious.
Oh, great episodes, Kev. Yeah. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because the episode of when they suck the happiness of their souls, it reminds me of a Danny Phantom episode in which the psychiatrist comes by to the school, and she helps the children who are going through depression, and they end up even being more depressed because she's sucking the happiness away. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. All right, so Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation was a TV movie that came out, and basically the story is of we see basically the main characters, what they're going through on summer vacation. We have Buster and Babs going down the river after there was a huge water fight involving with squirt guns, and then Babs basically flooded Acme Acres with a dam. We have Plucky, Hampton, and Hampton's family going over to Happy World Land, which is a spoof off of Disneyland. Let's see, we have Fifi LaFume wanting to meet a celebrity named Johnny Pugh. We have Elmira wanting to hug and squeeze and love animals, as always. And we have Shirley the Loom, who wants to do her fortune telling, but then we have Foulmouth, who wants to invite her over to a movie. And I think that was it for the most part. But yeah, the movie, how I got that movie was when my parents were separated. My dad knew this guy who bootlegged tapes, VHS tapes, and he got me a copy of Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation. I would watch that movie over and over and over again, especially around the summertime. It would always be a tradition for me to watch Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation. Even still to this day, every summer, I always watch Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spent My Vacation. I haven't done it this year yet, but I am planning on doing it.
For shame, Patty. For shame.
I've been busy. I'll probably watch it maybe either tomorrow or maybe next week. I know technically summer's over, but it's always been a tradition for me to watch that movie. And my mother and my sister, they've never seen the show, but they love the movie. Every single time we get to the scene in which Elmira goes over to the zoo and she teaches the class of, the predators and the prey, and then there was like so many funny moments, like her putting the zebra next to the baby cubs, and her grabbing the book and showing the gazelle of another gazelle being eaten by a lion or a cheetah, and then she says, "Look, Mr. Gazelle, that's you," and then she waves the book in his face and she said, "Kiss yourself, kiss yourself, kiss yourself." And my favorite part of that entire scene with Elmira was when all the animals who have been captured by Elmira go over to the lion, who is the king of the jungle. They complain to him about Elmira, about how, she's basically crazy. So finally Elmira gets over to the lion, and she said, "Hey, kitties, ready or not, here I come." And then the lion just stands up, walks up to her, and then she's like, "Well, if it isn't the king of the jungle." And then the lion roars, and then she says, "You don't have to yell. I know what you want. You want a haircut!" And she grabs a razor and she makes him look like Bart Simpson. And then she says, "Well, isn't that better?" And then the lion screams and yells, and then she says, "Long hair is so retro." And then all the animals just run away, and then she's just chasing after them. Every single time that scene comes up, my family would be laughing and laughing. That is one of the scenes that they remember still of that movie. And then another scene in the movie that we talk about all the time was when Buster and Babs reach over to Louisiana and they head over to the Gator's mansion. You have the three daughters and you have the father. And the three daughters want to marry Buster. And then they introduce themselves. They have Buster tied in a chair. And then the father comes along and then he comes up to him and he says, "Well, skin me alive and call me luggage. What do we have here?" And then the daughters introduce Buster, and then they were talking about courting, and then the father was like, "Oh, of course not, son. Courting's over. It's time for the wedding." And he's like, "What?" And then they were like he was scared, and the daughters were excited, and they were fighting about who was going to get married to Buster. And then we have all of them wanting to marry Buster, and then they, have like a three-person wedding, and then, Babs comes along dressed as the fireworks salesman, and basically she has the fireworks tied up in like this little patio, and she sends them all up, and then, she saves Buster's life. And then the ending, in which all of the villains throughout the movie come on by, and then they head over to the ship, and then they're being chased in the mine cart by the Jason Voorhees guy. And, it looks like something from Donkey Kong Country, in which they're in the mine cart, and, you're trying to get away from danger, and then the way they were able to get away from him, and they were able to get back to Acme Acres was through a plot hole. And I don't mean like, lazy writing. No, it's a literal plot hole that they fall into, and then they're back in Acme Acres. It's like, wow. That is just great. But yes, Tiny Toon Adventures, How I Spend My Vacation is still a great movie. Even though by the critics, they didn't really care too much about it. In fact, I remember a review by Leonard Maltin saying that it was really episodic, but I don't care. That movie has a huge staying power on me and on my family. We watch it every single summer. I love that movie to death. If you haven't seen it, please check it out.
Do you think it should win some Oscars there, Pat?
Okay, maybe it's not Oscar-worthy. It could be Emmy-worthy, but I don't know about Oscar-worthy per se. But still, I mean, it's a great, great movie. You have to see it if you haven't checked it out. Okay, how about you, Kevin? What are your stories behind How I Spent My Vacation?
Oh, I don't even know where to begin, but I do have an Elmira story. One of my favorite Elmira... what we're going to do is before we finish is to talk about your... what is your favorite Elmira moment? But my favorite Elmira moment would have to be when she guest starred on Animaniacs, and she goes to the heavyset security guard. She goes, "Excuse me, have you seen?" And they all free. It was hilarious. I love when they did crossovers with Animaniacs, which I thought was really, really cool. But what are some of? Oh, and the one where Elmira, when there was Pinky, Brain, and Elmira, and they're doing Titanic. And she's playing with them, interacting Titanic, and Pinky goes, "Oh well, that's terrible. This was just all. It wasn't so bad." And then the brain goes, "Yeah, we just hope she doesn't watch A Clockwork Orange."
Oh yes, I remember that one. That was so hilarious. I did not get that joke as a kid.
Nobody did. That was just funny. That was just hilarious.
Yeah, that was great. And then I think it was like one scene in which Pinky and Elmira were watching some sort of like Teletubbies parody, which they called it like the Chubby Babies. And then there was the one scene in which the brain was trying to teach Elmira about the planets, and I think, she was talking about the planets, and then every single answer she said was chocolate pie. It's like, what planet is close to the sun? Chocolate pie. How many miles is it from the Earth to the moon? Chocolate pie. Of course, you have the song, about the different, planets, which, I mean, for the most part, Tiny Toons is not really known for their musical cues. I mean, of course, Animaniacs steals it, but Tiny Toons had some pretty decent music, and with Elmira, especially when she's always with Montana Max, trying to get being on a date with him, or when she's trying to, hug Furball or trying to squeeze him. I think there was...
That's a little girl. That's Godzilla with bangs.
Yes, exactly.
That was the first episode that they were trying to, because the mother was trying to get Montana Max's mother was trying to always set up Elmira and Max, and that was hilarious.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that Montana was voiced by Danny Cooksey, whom a lot of people know as he was Budnick on Salute Your Shorts.
And he was also on Kung Fu Panda.
Yes, he was on Kung Fu Panda, the animated series, yes. Danny Cooksey was known for being in a lot of voiceover roles. He was, like being Montana Max, and he was in the Kung Fu Panda TV series. And also, in Hey Arnold, he was Stoop Kid.
Yeah, I wonder if he gets any recognition from Montana Max.
I don't know. I think for the most part, maybe he gets more recognition for his live action roles, but as for animated, maybe for voice acting enthusiasts.
I was going to ask you, what was your favorite memorabilia of Tiny Toons that you remember? Because they did have a lot of memorabilia.
I know that my tape was a bootleg, but man, I held on to that for years until eventually, I kind of lost it when I moved away. But I think, for the most part, one of my favorites as a kid was, my cousin used to rent video games at Blockbuster for the Super Nintendo, and I think that they had a Tiny Toons video game for the Super Nintendo, and, he rented that one time, and it was a lot of fun to play. It was like it was a pretty cool side-scrolling game. I don't remember which Tiny Toon game it was, but, yeah, it was a Tiny Toon game in which you played as Buster, and... it was like platforming similar to like Mario, and it was a pretty fun game. I really liked it. I never had any of the toys, unfortunately. I wasn't really much of a toy collector, but I did see a lot of the toys in Toys R Us when I was a kid. I saw Buster toys, I saw Plucky toys, and I saw Babs toys. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that the VHS tape and when my cousin rented the video game for the Super Nintendo.
I would have to. I had all. I'm actually trying to. Once I have money, I'm going to try to acquire all the Tiny Toons plushes because I had all of them. I had Buster, Babs, Plucky, and Hampton. And there was the Dizzy and Furball one that I needed to get, and I didn't get those for whatever reason. The Tweety Pie, I believe, or Sweetie Pie. I'm sorry, Sweetie Pie. She was very hard to find, and I just recently found out that back in 93 or 92, they made a Shirley the Loon Beanie Baby, or it was like a plush. And those go for like a ton of money because that was very limited edition. And I'm not talking about recently. This was back in the early 90s. I don't know why they didn't make a plush doll of her, like a larger scale. But apparently they made a limited amount of Shirley the Loon little Beanie Baby dolls. And this was before Beanie Babies, and it's like so impossible to find. So I really would love to have her. I don't know where I'm going to find her because if you go on eBay, it's like impossible. You type in Shirley the Loon, you don't really find anything. I had the plush dolls. I also remember at McDonald's they had the, like I said earlier before when we started our podcast, these were like little race cars. And Animaniacs sort of did the same when they released their toys. But basically, when you roll the wheels, you would have Buster, and then it would flip over to Elmira. And then there were also these, like, little wacky things that they would also do. They had a second release of Tiny Toon toys. And then to commemorate McDonald's, I forgot if it was the 50th or 60th birthday, they had different franchise toys. And one of them was Buster and Babs doing icing on a cake. They had Muppet Babies, they had Looney Tunes, they had Barbie, they had Sonic, which I thought was really cool. And I actually saw a commercial for Tiny Toons, McDonald's Tiny Toons as well. I don't remember the video game as much. I do know that they had one for Sega Genesis, but I think it was different. But that's the memorabilia that I remember the most. I did have the first season on DVD, but then I heard a rumor that they were not going to put out the later seasons. And in fact, that the later seasons, same thing like Animaniacs, had to be fan petition because I don't know why, but Warner Brothers were... I really wish that they would release complete series of them because it's so much easier. But they released like Volume 1 and Volume 2, and I think the My Summer Vacation ended up being a separate DVD.
It did.
Yeah, so that's my memorabilia of favorite memorabilia of Tiny Toons was the plush toys. They actually had a Buster and Babs pull string doll, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I don't have a clue on why, for the most part, they didn't release, like, the complete series on DVD. They released it in volumes, yes, you're right. But as for, like, complete episodes, yeah, for the most part, it hasn't been, like, a complete series. Like, if you were to say, like, oh, I want to buy the complete series of a certain show, like, for Nickelodeon, it's easy. I mean, we have the Doug, the complete series, and Hey Arnold, the complete series, Angry Beavers, the complete series. But no, for things like Tiny Toons and Animaniacs, they were released in volumes, and then eventually they were released in separate seasons. As of right now, there is no complete series of these shows on DVD, and even if there were, some of the episodes are not even released. Like, for example, if you want to have Tiny Toons How I Spend My Vacation, you have to buy it as a separate DVD, as opposed to, like, having it all together. There was one special of, Buster and Babs going on a vacation. The episode in which, Buster, Plucky, and Hampton find the case of beer. That's actually banned because, it was controversial, and I guess they didn't want to showcase it for little kids, and I can understand that.
Well, there's a rumor going around that it's also copyright issues. Apparently, Tiny Toons, they did a lot of satires and a lot of stuff. So I'm assuming that it has a lot to do with trying to get a hold of these. That's why the Muppet Babies never got a DVD release, was because they had a lot of clips from a lot of movies, and they had to pay the fees. And a lot of the clips from different stuff from Muppet Babies was Labyrinth, and Dark Crystal, which I don't know how. I mean, yeah, I understand that they're different companies. That's from Columbia, and Muppet Babies is by Disney, but it's still Jim Henson. But they did Star Wars, Star Trek. There was
Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones. A lot of Lucasfilms. Yeah, so they had to pay the fees to that, and even there was some references like Pee Wee Herman, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Beetlejuice. This was on Muppet Babies. So I'm assuming that even there was an episode with Stan Lee, Spider-Man, Marvel, and Dagwood, where the Muppet Babies, they go into like a comic strip world and they interact with all these different comic strip characters. The Peanuts and everything are a great example. So I'm assuming that, and that's why they didn't release it, because of the fees. So I'm assuming that's probably with Tiny Toons, that it was a little bit easier back then. Now it's just that they have to get the rights. So I don't know if that's the case or what, but I would assume that, being that it's Warner Brothers, they would be able to do that. But I don't know how that really works. But it would really be nice if they released the complete seasons of them, like the whole box set, not just a real crappy box set, but a really nice box set. With like a booklet, maybe an introduction with Steven Spielberg or the cast members. It'd be really cool, but only one can dream.
Yeah, that is true. It would be so awesome if we had a nice, huge, complete series with interviews and commentaries, a little documentary, everything that, that fans would just love to see. And, because of, networks such as The Hub and, the show running in syndication, it's still becoming really relevant to a lot of people, even the new generation of kids. Really like Tiny Toons and even Animaniacs. And, for the most part, I think, one of the good things about Tiny Toons was that they had the opportunity to showcase a lot of the Looney Tunes characters, but they decided to introduce new characters. They decided to create new characters so that we can be able to not only relate to the new characters because they were younger, but also have the opportunity to kind of branch out and take advantage of the wackiness that the Looney Tunes brought in. And they were able to do something new to it, which is fantastic. And, they become classics in their own right. And, for the most part, it's still a really great show. And if you haven't seen it, then go check it out. I don't know if they're still running Tiny Toons on the Discovery Kids network, or as it was...
Actually, they're not. For some, actually, just not to interrupt, they're actually no longer running all of the Steven Spielberg, Warner Brother cartoons like Animaniacs and Tiny Toons. In fact, they're not even running Batman the Animated Series. I think they're still running Gem. That's on and off. I'm pretty sure they're going to air the episodes again because the movie's coming out. And Transformers. They have not aired Tiny Toons and... Animaniacs in a while. Unfortunately, I hate to announce this, but for those folks, for our fans and the folks in Canada, they had just recently shut down Teletoon Retro. And Teletoon Retro last year had acquired the rights to Tiny Toons and Animaniacs and was airing it, and they were on a lot. And unfortunately, now that the network is shut down, Tiny Toons and even Animaniacs is not even on TV anymore, which sucks, but that's just the way it is. So
that's a shame. Well, I guess the only way you can be able to get it now is if purchase on DVD or see if they're on iTunes or on demand. However that you can be able to see it, try to see if you can support the official release. Anyway, one final question right before we go. Would you like to see a revival or a reboot or a remake of Tiny Toon Adventure?
Oh, God, no. When it comes to, from what I understand, it would probably air on Cartoon Network and the Looney Tunes show. And yes, I'm sorry, I'm going to openly admit this. I was not a fan of that show at all. Even though the show was trying to be upbeat and funny, they actually did a nod. In one scene, when there was one episode, it took place in a carnival. They had Plucky Hampton and Buster dolls at the carnival, so that they respect Tiny Toons. I don't personally think that the show would really be relevant today. They tried to bring back Beavis and Butthead, and basically the only thing that Beavis and Butthead that made fun of was Twilight, the Jersey Shore, and 16 and Pregnant. And I really don't think Tiny Toons can really go as far as they did today, because a lot of the stuff is just so bad. So I don't know. I don't know if a revival would be really that good, but we're gonna ask you guys and you tell us what you think.
Yeah, let us know in the comments below if you think there should be a Tiny Toon Adventures remake or revival or whatever. My rule for remakes and revivals is that unless you can do something different or do new interesting ideas but still retain what made the original so great, then go for it. If it doesn't need to be remade or if it's fine the way it is, don't touch it. Which I wish that Hollywood would pay attention because we are getting that Ghostbusters remake. Sorry.
To ruin my night.
I know. I am evil. Alright, well, I think that should be it for this installment of discussing about the Steven Spielberg cartoons. Tune in next time as we're going to be jumping into Animaniacs. So, we hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
And that's a wrap.